For those who don't know me, I'm James Travers. I'm Cultural Property Manager at the National Archives, and I have just come back after 3 months away on research sabbatical, which is a new thing for us and certainly a new thing for me. And in that 3 months, I was given a very simple research question to answer, which is, what does the digital shift mean for the status of archives? And what are the implications for tax incentive schemes, grant awarding bodies, and the export licensing system which currently work together to secure archives for the public alongside other forms of cultural property? I hope to be able to share some sort of initial findings, and you won't be surprised to learn I also have some further areas of research which may be of interest to you. My basic premise was that before the 1970s, archives were considered largely the financial responsibility of their owners and custodians. Since then, archival collections have benefited from a range of government tax incentives, public and private grants, protection from export, all through mechanisms originally devised to secure, acquire, catalogue and conserve works of art and museum objects for public benefit. Is the intangibility of digital a threat to this hard-won perception of archives as valuable cultural property and the funding that goes with it? Will archives revert to being seen as a liability rather than an asset? What motivation will owners have to preserve privately generated digital records without the prospect of realizing their financial value? So, all those questions. This is a very old slide of Cumbria Record Office, which I still think of as new, but which is probably more or less full by now. What I do when I'm not on sabbatical is give advice to grant awarding bodies on archival cases at the point where someone is prepared to spend money on archives, either through the tax system, the acceptance in lieu system, the acceptance in lieu scheme, the cultural giving scheme, or through conditional exemption, and purchase grant bodies like the National Heritage Memorial Fund, the Purchase Grant Fund, and the Friends of the National Libraries. All of these are interested in significant or preeminent archives. Archivists don't like making those judgments about their collections. They like to think that they love all their collections equally, but in practice they make those judgments all the time in deciding what they're going to conserve, catalogue, and indeed collect. In purchase cases, our expertise also extends to whether the price of the items is fair against the current market, and we have to take into account things like evidential and magical value. Magical value, there we are. And now we move on to Winnie the Pooh. You see, I told you my presentation was going to be lighter than some of the ones that you've had before. This is a traditional sales monitoring as it used to be. We've been monitoring, that is the Royal Commission on Historical Manuscripts now at the National Archives, monitoring the market in manuscripts since 1869, and we've actually got Sotheby's catalogues which predate the Historical Manuscripts Commission, so from about 1860, all with prices realised lovingly written into them. On the basis of, since 1993, a searchable database of prices realised, we can give advice on the sanity of valuations and dealer prices when grants are being awarded. This hasn't been a comfortable market. Over the last 10 years, it's changed radically. When I first started monitoring, we monitored about 250 catalogues a year from about 50 largely professional dealers and auction houses who have specialised in that kind of thing. Now we monitor around 400 events from 130 non-specialist and amateur auctioneers, generally speaking, though some of the professionals are still there, and that's counting eBay as one vendor. So the main change, though it has been fueled by technology and the internet, the main change has in fact been in the demographics of the market and in a retreat of the trade from any professional knowledge about archives, what's in them, or what they are worth. That's a retreat from analog even before we get to think about digital. The funding context, as I say, is in relation to other sorts of cultural property. So the acceptance in lieu scheme and the cultural giving scheme were set up to deal with museum objects and paintings. The conditional exemption scheme defers tax liability against heritage objects, provided the owners allow public access to them. All these things had art museum objects in mind, and even things like the Friends of National Libraries and the National Manuscripts Conservation Trust, which are avowedly focused on written heritage, they like nice things, tangible objects to deal with. Generally speaking, F&L are particularly fond of bindings. I've never understood the thing about bindings, but there you are. It's the same sort of menu like stamps, I think. But despite their relative lack of glamour, archives have always been very successful in getting grants from these bodies, because that closeness of the evidential value to the heritage is so easy to establish compared to, say, a vase. The first question the bodies always ask us is it worth it? And archives are, relatively speaking, cheap compared to art. Right, more nice things. Our sales monitoring work puts us on the documents working party of the reviewing committee on the export of works of art, which advises the Minister of State at DCMS on export policy as it relates to manuscripts. And they're meeting today, but William got me first, so I'm here instead. The thing to take away from this is that archives are zero rated, which means from the government point of view, they are interested in the evidential and cultural value of archives, while recognizing that they may not have a significant financial value at all. And I've just provided a link there to a Research Council policy internship, which is the first we've ever had at the National Archives, which I managed at the same time as doing my own sabbatical. And that was to look specifically at the impact of digital on the export system. And exporting intangibles, as you can imagine, is a whole new ball game. And her report is well worth reading if you have the time and patience with footnotes. My report has no footnotes whatsoever. One of the things, the first things that my research established is just how many bodies I looked at are undergoing some kind of review and looking at the kinds of questions that we are looking at today, but from very different angles. I came to William's previous event on digital and value, an invitational event, and the following day I was at Bonham's for an event related to the first 6 years of the Cultural Giving Scheme, which was set up theoretically to secure contemporary archives. What it did that acceptance in lieu didn't do was allow you to benefit before you died, which was supposed to make it attractive, because you could claim the value of your heritage asset against income tax rather than inheritance tax. One of the institutions that wanted that particular scheme to come in was the UK Literary Heritage Working Group, because they felt that contemporary papers of writers were going abroad too easily. They couldn't be stopped by export because they were export licensing because they were under 50 years old, and they had a premium associated with them, as literary archives do. The first 6 years of the Cultural Gift Scheme has not secured literary papers in any numbers. And I think digital may be an issue. It may also be that the scheme is not particularly generous. It only allows personal donors 30% of the value of their asset against tax, and I think most writers think they can do rather better than that, either in the US or waiting for AL, even though they have to be dead first. There are other people in a state of review at the moment. The Arts Council is reviewing its collections and cultural property function at the moment, and I think digital is a factor in that. There's a survey by Queen's University in Canada of what they call, I can't remember the words, the exact words they use, but the assessment of digital archives, the monetary assessment of digital archives. We had a seminar, the Gerald Elmas seminar at TNA, which brings together historians and archivists, and we looked at all sorts of questions about the future of historical research. A lot of that centered on the imperfections of archival capture and the lack of skills of historians confronted by digital. We didn't really look in any great detail about whether the records that researchers currently rely on are going to be collected and archived at all, and the sort of threat to private record keeping that I'm looking at. Anyway, so all these people were looking. The DPC's own Jenny Mitchum spoke at that event and said we should value digital as we do analog. We didn't, unfortunately, have the time to follow up on that particular remark and the implications of it. So in my research, I had sort of 5 possible futures for how we assess the value of digital as cultural property. That the current mechanisms will cope as they are. You've always got to have that one in, however unlikely it may be. I think Arts Council is quite sanguine about being able to cope with digital, and we have a few digital cases in the pipeline. 2, that there are minor gaps in skills and knowledge that we can identify and mitigate. 3, that there's something much more profound going on that necessitates some radical change. 4, that we need new mechanisms entirely. And 5, and this may resonate slightly more, that archives will lose their status as cultural property and should concentrate on seeking discretionary funding and protection from sources designed not to secure pots and paintings, but other types of data. Right, my initial findings. The market in archives. Despite the fact that digital archives retain the same evidential value as analog archives, and that financial value and success of archives in competition with other forms of cultural property is based on evidential value rather than aesthetic value, there is currently no public market in digital archives and no private collector interest in them. A market could be established as digital and digital-heavy hybrid archives come through tax incentive schemes and begin to build up a body of comparators. New mechanisms to secure digital archives are unlikely to be devised given the resource required and the lack of financial imperative. All the people in the trade I spoke to were very sad about just how little money there was in archives. A market based on institutional acquisition by tax incentives and private sale is likely to lead to lower archival prices given the lack of private collector interest. Would this lower the status of archives? This, by the way, at the bottom is George, who's the son of my colleague Tim Powell and Lucy Powell at Bath Record Office. So if there's a lesson there, if you want to involve young people in archives, breed them yourselves. It works very well. There were questions about the skills and capacity of the book and manuscript trade. The established book and manuscript trade believes there's no driver to preserve private records without a financial imperative, but it won't take the lead in creating a market in digital because it doesn't have the skills and there is insufficient financial motive to acquire them. With the growth of non-specialist and amateur market, professional capacity and knowledge of archives of all kinds among vendors and value is contracting. There's definitely a job for a bright young thing somewhere, but I'm not sure I'm young enough. Hybrid current collecting. Current digital acquisitions tend to be part of hybrid archives acquired by private sale, with the digital generally thrown in or assigned a notional value. There's general agreement that we're reaching a tipping point where new acquisitions will become predominantly digital, and we can't go on throwing it in indefinitely. Rights, issues and responsibilities. Now this is where I really copped out big time, and where my research, my future avenues of research really come into their own. It's not yet clear how current mechanisms will negotiate the relationship between digital archives and intellectual property rights. Estates offering archives to public ownership through acceptance in lieu have traditionally retained the rights and sold the physical papers. If digital archives lose market value, will their valuation for tax purposes be based solely on their rights? Will digital archives have to be offered with their rights? Does digital redefine and redistribute ownership? Can any of the current mechanisms continue to operate if ownership is unclear? Institutions acquiring digital art are becoming used to acquiring rights only in a particular copy. Will archive services be content to do the same? An ad hoc system of trading the value of rights against the costs of preservation as a condition of deposit is already in operation in some places. There's also a sense of the sort of transitional value of archives, that unlike pots and paintings, the value isn't realized at the point of acquisition, but as it's used and shared later in the process, and somehow the digital sharpens that distinction. I've talked a little bit already about the sort of reviews and state of uncertainty in government and other agencies about all these things. And as I say, they're looking in rather different ways at quite similar questions. And importantly, I think, this goes back to something Neil said, talking about it in very different language, and bridging that gap is very important. New and existing grant funders are interested in digital delivery, but are unsure how best to direct funds to support and sustain the activity. There's an openness among purchase funders to new and coordinated ways to meet changing demand. Special interest groups like Art 360 for contemporary artists are campaigning for the cultural giving scheme to work better to support the acquisition of digital contemporary artists' works and archives, and are supporting the management of their estates through an archiving app, which is very exciting, to ensure they become usable, come to market in usable form. And the Group for Literary Archives and Manuscripts is also, at its most recent meeting, decided to concentrate its efforts on these questions of digital acquisition as a new sort of imperative, so that some groups of private records will be better served by professional groups and better prepared, because we've talked already about early intervention and not leaving it to the archivist to be left with a version of something they cannot use. I think some privately generated digital records will come to the archive in better state than others, because of this sort of special interest in them. Around professional practice, does digital signal the end of benign neglect? If the flow of preeminent and significant private archives into public ownership is to continue, there needs to be a more proactive and coordinated approach to preserving in situ. Will private records currently collected continue to be collected in digital form? Does digital spell the end of that inertia collecting, as I said? I think we, from our sort of monitoring point of view, have to think about whether we're using the right terms and whether we're set up to actually discover the stuff that's out there on the market potentially. I want to say a little bit about stewardship costs and value, just a couple of things that are already out there. We know that some institutions are asking for cataloguing costs for donated archives already, so there is some idea, some precedent out there for the kind of stewardship costs that we've been talking about with digital preservation, there is a sense that the acquiring institutions might narrow according to digital capacity. It's worth bearing in mind, even in the analog context, that I think 9 of the 12 most recent acceptance in lieu cases for private personal papers have gone to 3 institutions. I mean, it's not a particularly wide field at the moment. There is a precedent in the conditional exemption scheme for stewardship costs accruing to the owner, so that we help the HMRC decide what's a proportionate contribution by the owner to care and cataloguing, and you can see that being adapted to a digital context. And there are contexts for sort of social value, new sorts of ideas of value for digital records, such as the Cleveland, Ohio police violence records, which got quite a lot of funding from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, on the basis that, I mean, there were only tweets and things which are largely thought of in most contexts as being ephemeral, but because they were part of a campaign with a great deal of social heft behind it, suddenly their preservation became something that people wanted to put money into. I won't talk at enormous length about my recommendations, except to say I think it is a chance to look again at our relationships with funders, because there has been, I think, a focus on digital delivery, digital access, and now might be the time to shift the conversation on to stewardship and preservation, without which you cannot have access. We've been talking to HLF for 20 years about, you can't have access without cataloguing. I think digital sort of shifts and sharpens that particular argument. DCMS obviously are looking at this kind of thing through their Culture is Digital initiative. Again, that's thinking about digital delivery and digitization in museums in its first iteration, but I think there must be capacity there. And so we're looking at also at capacity building. We managed to secure from Ministry of Justice funding, new burdens funding for local authorities accessioning new public records under the 20-year rule, which came to them more quickly than they would have done under the 30-year rule. Is there capacity for similar funding to come to institutions taking preeminent digital archives through the tax system, for example? And are there knock-on benefits from our work with public records around authenticity, for example? And so there are, there are ways forward for us in terms of our shared data and expertise in sort of establishing a body of comparators for digital archives, if the trade is reluctant to do it. In terms of further research, I mean, these are the big questions which the technically minded among you will have realized that I have sidestepped deftly so far. And they are around authenticity and value. Are there different evidential values of different instances of digital records? And what about the added value of metadata? Access control and value, rights issues relating to private archives in public repositories. Archival science and the commercial market in digital. The gap between what we understand of the nature and status of digital archives and how they're traded. The thing about transitional value I've already mentioned. Do we need significance criteria which recognize that value grows as material is shared and used? And then something around rights and ownership. Will collecting institutions provide access on a non-exclusive basis? I think that's all I have to say for the moment.
Thank you very much, James. We should pause for some questions. We do have quite a good discussion session towards the end of the day, but seems to me there's a ton of stuff in here for us to be getting into if we wanted to ask James a rare opportunity to ask some of these questions as well. I mean, I'm struck by the lack of there's obviously an expectation among government that the way that we establish value is through the functioning of the market, and the market's not willing to take that function on. That's a fair summary, isn't it?
Yeah,
and whether it's unwilling to take it on because it doesn't have the expertise or because there's no value seems to be a moot question, you know?
Yeah. Well, we're hoping for some test cases very soon, and the wheels move slowly most of the time, and what we don't know is whether it's just undergoing its usual parabola, or whether it's particularly slow because there are technical and logistical reasons why the usual mechanisms aren't functioning.
Yep. Anyone? Where to begin? It's a tough one.
Yeah, I'm glad I had a whole 3 months. I could have done with slightly longer.
I mean, I'm tempted to ask you those other research questions. Is it reasonable to expect that you'll have a chance to do that additional research? Because it doesn't. It seems to me you've peeled back the cover, and now we need to see what's beneath the surface.
I'm not sure I'm the best placed person, certainly, to do all of them. Perhaps one of them that's sort of closest to my current role, but TNA has some experts in this area, but I don't think it's something I'm suggesting we do internally and alone.
Okay, so there's a research project here looking for partners.
Exactly.
Neil, you had a question.
Very quick question, James. It's I guess it's about valuation of some of the things which are born digital, which are perhaps new, traditional things which we've monitored before. So I was just wondering if there an emerging market, perhaps things like computer games, because I know there's a lot of interest there in the sort of private individuals in emulation on early games and so on. I don't know if that's a trading environment as well, and whether values are beginning to be put on certain types of digital archive which don't have a traditional analog equivalent.
I think that's almost certainly true. We had, as part of the Aylmer seminar, we had a guy from the Video Games Museum who was going to talk about some of those issues, and that would have been very useful, but unfortunately he was indisposed. But I'm sure there is value there, but it's not talked about in the same way, and the people who deal in it don't talk in the same language again. The people who deal in what we think of as archive.
I'm aware of a case from just this week where a Japanese computer game, and I'll forget the details of this, but a Japanese computer game was a rare kind of 1990s version of a particular implementation of a particular Japanese computer game was on sale effectively on eBay or some other auction sites are available.
I should have said that.
And the auction ended up in the tens of thousands of US dollars, and was bought by a Japanese collector on the exact premise that he felt it was inappropriate for it to be exported to the US. And it seems to me to package up as a little case study a lot of the things which are in play here, what you're describing. I mean, there's also a kind of cultural appropriation issue going on here. They didn't want preservation Western preservation to go on this particular item. But we should maybe try and get a case study. It was Jason Scott who was kind of talking on that on Twitter a couple of days ago. Anyway, there is an active market there for sure, what you're describing. Let's. Oh, a couple of hands going up. Yeah, do you want to go, Paul?
Brief comment on your case study there. That's more of a hybrid firmware software preservation issue rather than a digital collection issue. And I see that there's probably a difference between what is purely digital and what is hybrid in that context, because there is definitely a market there for that type of thing, as you say. But for the stuff that you can just copy, download, whatever, that's much more difficult, and possibly the value lies in the preparation and self-curation before you hand it over.
Indeed. Yes, the sale of a collection, effectively, which has already been gone through some form of curation.